Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 66 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Before we get started with this week's question, we have some listener feedback from last episode regarding superheroes and villains with military ranks in their names. One of the examples I pointed to as having an accurate military rank was Commander Steel of DC Comics. Rob G pointed out that there is no rank of Commander in the Marines, and so Commander Steel could not have had that rank, as I stated. He is absolutely correct. I took my original source as correct without double-checking that information, and I apologize. Doing some deeper research into the character, I found that Hank Haywood Sr. was a captain in the Marines. He originally went by the codename Steel at first, and was dubbed Commander Steel by President Roosevelt after saving him and Winston Churchill from an assassination attempt. Roosevelt called it a field promotion, even though it had nothing to do with his actual rank in the military, which may have led to the confusion in my source. I apologize for the error, and will try to do better next time. Thanks for bringing that to my attention, Rob. If I get something wrong, I definitely want to know. Another topic I want to touch on before diving into today's episode is the unfortunate passing of Chadwick Boseman. Obviously, his role as Black Panther is the most relevant to this channel, but in addition to his time in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he was also critically acclaimed for playing such real-life historical figures such as James Brown, Jackie Robinson, and Thurgood Marshall. And during much of this time, he was silently battling cancer, with only his closest friends and family being aware. The quiet strength and dignity he showed, both on and off screen, should be an example to us all. Unfortunately, during the last year or two, as he was losing weight while combating the disease, some people mocked the actor online. My hope is that, if there's one thing that comes from this, that people take a moment before making comments about others, whether celebrities or not, and remember that everyone has their own struggles they are going through, and you may not be aware of all the circumstances surrounding a person's life at the moment, and that all mocking does is cause unnecessary pain. Okay, I'm going to climb down off of my soapbox now and get into this episode's question. We're talking about role-playing again, with a question from Allison R., who asks this very lengthy question. Does lore, or the worlds built by authors and game makers, actually matter for things like D&D or Vampire the Masquerade? Or should it matter more? Should noobs be given a primer on Vampire or other tabletop systems? If so, or if not a full primer, what do you recommend for the elements of gaming of this nature where lore could matter? That's a great question. The quick answer is, of course, it varies. But there's obviously a baseline you'll need. For instance, if you play Vampire the Masquerade and you go into the game not knowing what the Masquerade is, you're going to get yourself in trouble pretty quickly. For those who don't know, in the world of vampire, it's not common knowledge that vampires exist. The Masquerade is the name of the vampire conspiracy to prevent humans from learning that fact. The biggest factor in this is going to be your game master, or GM, and how much lore they want to bring into the campaign themselves. If you're playing in a world that was home-brewed by the GM, as opposed to one of the pre-published worlds that was created by employees of the game's creator, most likely they're going to want to tell you all about the world that they've created, and will give you quite a bit of knowledge beforehand. In fact, in some cases, it's hard to get them to stop telling you about the world so that you can actually play in it, but that's a topic for another episode. But Allison's questions seem to focus primarily on those games with a pre-published set of lore, so let's focus on those. As I mentioned before, some game systems have a few different worlds that you can play on, each with their own set of lore, which usually also affects the rules in some ways as well. D&D is a prime example of this. When it was first published, Dungeons & Dragons focused on two different worlds: Greyhawk, created by Gary Gygax, and Blackmoor, created by Dave Arneson. With Arneson leaving TSR, the original publisher of D&D, in the early 1980s, Greyhawk became the standard world for Dungeons & Dragons. But soon other settings were created and published, including Krynn, the world of Dragonlance, Athos, a post-apocalyptic world outlined in the Dark Sun books, the steampunk-like world of Eberron, and the current baseline world for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, the Forgotten Realms. When I say baseline, what I mean is that the core rulebooks for D&D include a few extra paragraphs here and there for how things might be different on other worlds, but for the most part, all of the lore given in the books assume your campaign is taking place in the Forgotten Realms in that world's present day. Each of these different campaign settings has a history stretching from the world's origin to what is considered to be the current year in that world. As new books are released and new editions come out, that history is slowly expanded on. For instance, when The Forgotten Realms was first published, adventures were taking place in the early to mid 1300s by that world's calendar. But current adventures are set in the 1490s. And depending on when your campaign is taking place, things can be very different, so be sure to ask. So, how much of this lore should you know, and how do you go about learning it? In an ideal world, you would know everything about the world your character lives in that your character would know. But unless you can somehow spend years in an alternate dimension living out their life, that's just not feasible. So, let's get more realistic. The most important things to know are pretty basic. Who am I? When and where am I? And what do people think of me? Who you are is decided during character creation, and your first resource is the rulebook. If you're playing in one of the pre-published settings, then a lot of in-universe information that your character should know will be mixed right in with the rules that you as a player will use. So when you're first creating your character, be sure to read all the information they give you about the different options you decide on. In D&D, that would include things like race and class. In Vampire the Masquerade, your clan is a similar choice. That in-universe information will usually have answers for the third question as well. For instance, if you're an elven wizard, when reading through the book, you should find a paragraph telling you what the other races think and feel about elves. And then you'll also find a brief description of how non-wizards usually react to spellcasters in general. Of course, these are all generalities, and there will be exceptions, but it's a good starting point. If you're playing in a homebrew campaign setting, you'll want to ask your GM these kinds of questions, ideally before you've made your final decisions about your character. If you decide to be an elf, but then find out that in this GM's world that most people think elves are actually demonic creatures that need to be exterminated, you may change your mind about which race you want to be. Or not, perhaps that sounds like an interesting role-playing challenge for you. This now leaves when and where you are. The pre-published settings, and many homebrew settings as well, will have a world map showing you the shape of the continents and giving you a basic idea of their terrain. You should ask your GM where on that map things are starting out, and find out if there were any major events that happened there that would be common knowledge. Again, if you're playing in a pre-published setting, once you get told where you are starting, you should find at least some basic information in the rulebook about the climate, terrain, population, and government of that area, as well as some broad strokes of history. I mentioned back in episode 59 the possibility of a Session 0, where everyone creates their characters together and does some other prep work that helps make the first session run more smoothly. In addition to, or in lieu of, the information in the book, this is an excellent opportunity for you and the other players to ask questions together so that you all have a baseline pool of knowledge that you share. Currently, I'm the GM in a Pathfinder 2nd Edition game. If you're unaware, Pathfinder is a system fairly similar to D&D, but with some differences, especially in the world's lore. And I'm running my group through a pre-written adventure path. One of the more recent innovations that I've seen with these long-form campaigns is a player's guide, available as a free PDF download that the players can read, which usually includes a map of the town that they're starting in with major locations like stores, churches, and government buildings marked. Also included is a brief history of the local area, and usually some character hooks, which are some possible motivations that each player can choose for why their character gets involved in the campaign. These are incredible resources for both the players and the GM, and if you're playing in a game that has one of these available, I highly recommend reading it front to back a few times to really immerse yourself into the world you'll be inhabiting as your character. As a GM, it's great when the players come in with some of this knowledge ready at their fingertips, so that they can really act like a local resident. For instance, let's say I ask a player whose character has supposedly lived in town for years, "It's a typical Friday evening. What are you up to?" If they have to ask, "Well, is there an inn or a tavern around?" and then I have to describe the two different inns that are open, then they say, "Okay, I go to that first one." That's much less immersive than if I ask that same question and they're able to say, "Oh, I'm at Cadence Keg listening to Bryn tell her old adventuring stories like usual." While I don't expect that necessarily, especially from beginning players, it's much more likely to happen with those players' guides being readily available to everyone. Overall, the more information you can gather about the world you'll be in before you start playing, the better. But I think answering those basic questions of who, where, and when you are, and how the average person sees you, will give you a really good starting point. But don't let that be the end point. At any time during the game, if you feel there's some piece of knowledge that your character should have, feel free to ask your GM. If they feel that it's common enough knowledge, they should just let you know. If it's more esoteric, then they'll probably ask you to make some sort of roll to find out if this is something your character happens to know. And when you learn something mid-game, don't forget to take notes. It's easy to forget those little details, especially when you go a week or more between sessions. So if you can keep good records, it'll help you stay immersed in the game and make things go faster, as you won't have to re-ask questions that you already asked before. Speaking of questions, I hope that answered yours, Allison. Role-playing is one of my favorite pastimes, so I love getting questions on that topic. in addition to questions about comics, superheroes, sci-fi, fantasy, and all the rest. Remember, this show runs on your questions, so please let me know what you want to learn more about next. You can send your queries, corrections, or just comments on the show in general via email to welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or, if you prefer to remain anonymous, just go to welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link and fill out the form there. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. If you'd like to support the show directly, you can become a patron at patreon.com/welcometogeektown for just $1 per month. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Lovitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.